I've always been interested in ownership. Who's music for? There doesn't seem much point in being a maker of music without thinking about this. Big questions start piling up. Not only who's music for, but has that ownership changed? And if so, is music even a single thing? It's heady stuff. So I'm going to show how the development of European music since 1750 comes down to the question of who it's written for. That's how it became, well, modern. When I was 21, I heard on the radio two established composers give different views about whether they consider the audience in their creative process. They gave plausible but opposing views as to whether the listener is the whole point or a huge distraction. This debate would have confounded a Baroque composer. Leaving aside the amazing idea of ignoring the audience, our Baroque composer, who after all was a craftsman working to order, would assume that musical states, as expressed, were known to the listener, part of a kind of customer deal. More on that later. But how do we get from that compact in little more than 200 years to a position such as I heard on the radio that you must ignore the audience because you don't know them? Ownership of art is like climate change. It's a force so big that it operates out of view, and it's hard to agree on. But you can't be a composer of any kind of art music today without confronting the fact that ownership of our stuff has severely narrowed. The days when a letter could be addressed to Giuseppe Verdi, Italia, are long gone, or at least such communal ownership has passed to household names in the commercial sector. I think the question, why do listeners struggle with new art music, is always going to be before us as composers. Does no music since 1914 make any sense? Does it deploy no craft? Is there no genius? Is the beauty that I find in our age an illusion? Have we all been having a laugh since 1914? All that seems pretty unlikely. On the contrary, I think that the same skill, craft, thought, and on occasion genius informed music since 1914, just as they always did. But something's been going on, and unhappy listener syndrome is no illusion. Or maybe no listener syndrome, for part of our story is a narrowing of listenership as musics diversify. What interests me is that all artists, like all politicians, are victims of historical circumstance. On the surface, sure, we appear to strike out, to choose our own direction, but the wider environment of the parameters and currents of change that govern our choices is utterly beyond our control. Mostly we don't even look up to see these bounds. Like animals in an enclosure, we patrol paths within a perimeter of which we are barely aware. In music, such a perimeter fence might be something like, well, the contract that a society has with its production of music. Thinking about how European music in the 18th century works, for example, the most casual observer will pick up its homogeneity. Numerous pieces offer the same surface. This, in turn, is because of shared rhythmic tropes and the speed of harmonic change. This is not just about the music itself, it's about its social ownership. A prevailing artistic philosophy was the Affektenlehre, or doctrine of affections, which held that art could express universally owned expressive states. This was no guessing game. It actually included musical fingerprints. For example, the martial trumpet fanfare, pom-diddy-pom, the falling lament bass, or the cycle of fifths. All these shared devices conveyed states that could be received and decoded by the listener. Given such specifics, public ownership was, of course, very high. Listeners enjoyed the sort of fulfillment of expectation that we would now get from a fashionable popular music. In the later 18th century, which, we call classical and talk of its new traits, those affections can still be discerned at work. The pervasive rhythmic hooks that lead off and set the tone unmistakably. Now, when a piece like that starts, we're all on the same page as to what it's about. But if identifiable states are the currency, where does that leave contrast, drama, event? These are, after all, the stuff of communication. Well, in fact, a great deal of Mozart and Haydn's greatness comes from subverting background certainty with surprises. It is the sheer variety of their behaviours that lifts their music above the commonplace. However, Haydn in particular was greatly appreciated in his lifetime, so his surprises cannot be wholly subversive. Clearly, the listener was in on the joke. This Haydn quartet soon catches us out with a surprise harmony. Now, the shock of that entrance on a remote harmony, the sixth degree, is boosted by the silence preceding it, but it resolves in a way the educated ear would have understood, while being agreeably piqued by the deviation. And the opening security prepares us with secure ground first. So what happens is that we are set up for the gag as surely as by any stand-up comedian. We have to have three men walking into a bar before anything happens to them. Or do we? Well, that apron of expectation, the reassuring intro in 18th century classical works, marks a high point of listener ownership in European art music. But composers are not given to perpetuating the status quo. As I said, Haydn and Mozart in particular favoured subversive uncertainties which, being more interesting, limit mass ownership. Even in the 1780s, this famous introduction to Mozart's C major string quartet was causing ripples with its harmonic boldness. However, its revolutionary import seems to me much wider than the mere dissonances that gave it its misleading nickname. Never mind that Mozart's harmonies come from another world than that of his listeners. He does nothing to prepare us. The first movement abandons the contract whereupon a clear affection would be set up and then undermined. Instead, we start with a musical no man's land, a move unique in the 18th century. Only from those depths does Mozart find his way to the sunlit uplands. No listener had a contract with this opening, struggling from the first to grasp the expressive terrain. Haydn, the dedicatee of this work, seems to have understood it, for he did something similar to open The Creation 10 years later, but others not. To me, the boldness of the geography here is a bigger issue than the harmony itself. And all this occurs well ahead of the early 19th century, when Mozart's successors, Beethoven and Schubert obviously, followed his example, as they too dispensed with the preliminary securities to get the drama going from the outset, and in doing so, turned the screw on the listener. For example, much is made of revolutionary expression in Beethoven's great C-sharp minor string quartet, but its fugal opening is a model of reasoned discourse compared with its near contemporary, Schubert's own last quartet, the G major. G major so called, but the battle is joined from the top with no pleasantries. Tonic or dominant, major or minor, keep up at the back. This quartet is perhaps Schubert's most intense piece of large-scale argument, a freewheeling harmonic ride that pretty much banishes the notion of surprise altogether. It's all surprise and no polite preliminaries. For whom is this music designed? Already we can say that no social contemporary would have been prepared for following it by their daily listening. Truly, it creates its own affect. Moving through the Romantic period, this sense grows of an individual exploration, charted from a work's outset, with, of course, a corresponding dwindling in the certainties of expressive ownership. At the piano, Chopin in the 1830s seemed to be improvising the opening of his own first ballade. A recent paper by Benedict Taylor has pointed out that Mendelssohn, in this late quartet from 1847, the F minor, opus 80, was blurring the idea of opening theme with that of less obviously thematic figuration, an experimental lurch, perhaps one below the radar, that still veers markedly away from defined musical behaviours. Moving on 40 years, we find Bruckner opening his 8th symphony in wholly uncharted terrain. Frankly, the fabric has to be assembled around us here. We start in the void. The antecedents in Beethoven's famous 9th Symphony are clear, but Bruckner's terrain is now a fragmentary dream zone. Many other symphonists come in on this game. Mahler opening his first, Sibelius opening, most of his, and likewise Brahms, for whom every material is intrinsic and nothing merely preparatory or filling. Truly, this was the age of substance, not reassurance. The communally understood coded scene setting that opened the classical symphony or sonata is largely gone by the end of the 19th century, when sonata drama has become too searching, too personal for mere polite preamble. Okay, not entirely so. We can all think of exceptions, for example, the openings of Tchaikovsky's 5th and Mahler's 7th. These and others do open with some sort of clear prevailing affection. But the notion of controlled disruption, the lightly skimming pebble that in classical works sent ripples over an established surface, has, by the time of later Romantic music, become a huge opening splosh, one that could be caused by anything at any point. Surprise becomes the new normal. The other thread in this development, and of course it's one of Romanticism's core tenets, is the rise of individual revelation. The multiple vicissitudes of Romantic drama, especially after Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, proclaim personal expression. If these are the artist's inner thoughts, how can we know them in advance? Most of this is again a far cry from those classical affects. So what's this change about? It's about the ownership of music passing from a social group to the individual, and this long before riots over the Rite of Spring and so on. The more personal and exploratory is our listening, the less it's going to be a matter of public agreement, and the more that the listener-composer contract, a kind of one-way ticket for the journey, becomes a personal negotiation. From Dvorak's symphonies to Reger's string quartets, drama and uncertainty are the material in late Romantic music, a heady brew of continuing harmonic exploration and aesthetic shift towards the personal. The sense that a work now begins by assembling an autonomous language and material, which I think is essential to Wagner, is nowhere stronger than in the one-movement sonata by Wagner's pianistic contemporary and friend, Franz Liszt. Like the Bruckner, Liszt's sonata opens with vanishingly brief fragments, just a note, then a scale, as inchoate musical life emerges from the primeval swamp. It takes a full couple of minutes for direction to emerge. So I refute the popular view of music's having suddenly gone mad around 1910 after many centuries of genial sharing. For we've seen how, in fact, public ownership had been in prolonged decline as the contract between romantic composer and listener became one ever more tailored, confessional and specialised. The exploratory works of early modernism by Bartók and Schoenberg only continue the individuation of Liszt and co. to a further point. And as we look back at these two historic trends, the growth of music's experimental discourse and the gradual narrowing of artistic ownership, it's clear they're entwined. In this way, I believe, the path to modernism was an inexorable one. For, as I said, composers are, in the end, prisoners of circumstance. How can we chart this move from an open landscape peppered with clear and conventionally placed obstacles to an ever more complex one in which strife and uncertainty prevail? Well, we can borrow some useful terms from information theory. Redundancy is a good way of thinking about what we take for granted, like the cheerful opening harmony of a classical symphony. We expect it, we're less aware of it. It's redundant. Information, meanwhile, denotes what's significant because it's exceptional. Haydn's Surprise Symphony actually acquires its name from a surprise orchestral crash in the slow movement. It's a spike of information, all right, while the preceding regularity of the theme is high in redundancy by comparison, and each of these needs the other to work. The more information a work projects, the less redundancy it offers as padding, and the harder the listener must work without the high levels of accepted currency that oiled the works of classicism. This is the issue of listener struggle. If we listen to a work of Bartók in the 1920s, say, we rely mostly on the work itself to create initial expectation, redundancy, from which it can then depart. So we don't start with much communal expectation, much borrowed redundancy. In his second violin sonata, Bartók conjures a bleak opening lyricism, but we have to work that out and then run with it, which is a big task for an unprepared listener. The philosopher Adorno wrote later in the 20th century that the composer should be surprised by his own materials, much as a chemist contemplates a test tube. Not much hope for the listener in that case, if even the composer's surprised. That was an extreme from which I believe more recent aesthetics have pulled back. The composer Birtwistle has asserted, when asked how he starts a piece, that there's something called the idea. He's right. Any worthwhile artwork offers an idea in some form, and with it subverts our reality. So, dear listener, your task is a big one. Lacking communal ownership of art music in the age of individuation, you still have to identify that idea and follow where the composer takes it. The composer's role, likewise, is daunting, to communicate with coherence, both without the help of shared codes and without resorting to crass vacuities. Here's Birtwistle leading us into the maze of his Silbury air. In this way, I believe, the harmonic newness and rhythmic pungency of music of the early 20th century and beyond are only part of the story. It's not so much their shock in itself that continues to confound unpracticed listenership, but its lack of context, the corresponding overload of uncharted information. It's also new. We designate something as a surprise because we take its surrounds as normal or redundant. But what if there is no normal, no preparation? Then nothing and everything is a surprise. I love this quotation from the musicologist Leonard Meyer when he was writing about the wildly experimental 1960s. He wrote, "It is probable that new music angers listeners not because their aesthetic sensibilities are offended, but because their psychic security, their sense of control, is seriously threatened. We are pattern-making creatures, and we struggle with disordered information overload. What moves us may be a weird cocktail of amazement and confirmed expectation. You need to trust the composer, and that's a big ask in itself now that wide social ownership of art music is scattered to the winds. A clear loss of affection, perhaps."